The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies swallowed the frantic rhythm of her horse's hooves. Clara pulled her wool shawl tight, glancing back at the dimming lights of the mining camp. She thought she had vanished into the night until a massive shadow blocked her path. The floorboards of Mrs. Gable's boarding house groaned a familiar, treacherous tune, but Clara Higgins knew precisely where to step. It was 10 minutes past midnight in the unforgiving silver mining town of Deadwood Gulch. The air inside her cramped room was frigid, the small cast-iron stove having died out hours ago. But Clara was sweating. Her trembling hands worked furiously in the dark, stuffing the last of her earthly possessions into a scuffed leather valise that had belonged to her late father. 2 spare cotton dresses, a tintype photograph of her parents, a handful of salted biscuits, and a heavy, oiled Colt .45 revolver wrapped tightly in a piece of flannel. Clara paused, her breath misting in the freezing air, and listened. From down the hall came the rhythmic, heavy snores of the other boarders. But her mind was fixed on a man who didn't live in this house. Sheriff Josiah Danvers. Just hours earlier, Josiah had stood in the dusty thoroughfare outside the Mercantile, his silver star catching the cruel midday sun, and loudly proclaimed to the town that he and Clara were to be wed by the end of the week. He hadn't asked her. He hadn't needed to. In Deadwood Gulch, Josiah Danvers was the law, the judge, and the executioner. Ever since Clara's father, William Higgins, had perished in a highly suspicious dynamite blast at the Lady Luck mine 3 months prior, Josiah had slowly tightened a noose around Clara's life. He had frozen her father's bank accounts, seized the deed to their family home under the guise of unpaid municipal taxes, and isolated her from anyone who dared offer her a kind word. Tomorrow, she knew, he would come to claim her. She had to leave tonight, or she would never leave at all. Clara slipped her arms into a heavy woolen coat, grabbed the valise, and crept out of the room. The hallway was a tunnel of ink. She navigated the stairs by memory, sliding her calloused fingertips along the peeling wallpaper. Every creak of the timber sounded like a gunshot in the silent house, but she made it to the back door, slipping out into the biting chill of the autumn night. The town was a sprawling scar of mud, canvas tents, and rough-hewn pine buildings nestled deep in a canyon. A few amber lights flickered from the saloons on the main strip, accompanied by the muffled, tinny sound of a badly tuned piano. But the back alleys were quiet. Clara hugged the shadows, her boots sinking into the semi-frozen mud as she made her way toward the livery stable at the edge of town. The stable smelled intensely of wet hay, leather, and manure. A single kerosene lantern swung gently from a rafter, casting long, wavering shadows. In the corner, Amos, the elderly stablemaster, was slumped in a chair, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey resting on his chest. He was dead to the world. Clara moved swiftly past him to the third stall. Her roan mare, Daisy, let out a soft, recognizing snort. "Shh, girl," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she stroked the horse's velvet muzzle. "We're going on a long trip, just you and me." Her hands were clumsy with cold and adrenaline, but desperation made her fast. She threw a heavy blanket over Daisy's back, heaved the saddle up, and tightened the cinch. She strapped her valise behind the cantle and slid the wrapped colt into the saddlebag, keeping it within easy reach. As she led Daisy out of the stall, the horse's iron shoe struck a loose cobblestone. The sharp clack echoed loudly. Amos snorted, shifting in his chair. "Who's there?" he mumbled, his hand instinctively dropping toward the shotgun leaning against the wall. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held her breath, pressing herself against Daisy's warm flank. Amos blinked his bleary eyes at the swinging lantern, muttered something incoherent about the draft, and let his chin drop back to his chest. Exhaling a shaky breath, Clara led the mare out the wide back doors of the stable and into the vast, consuming darkness of the trail. The road out of Deadwood Gulch was a treacherous, winding path that hugged the edge of a deep ravine, climbing thousands of feet into the high mountain passes. It was a route meant for daylight, for heavily guarded stagecoaches, not for a solitary woman riding out into a coming winter storm. But as she swung herself up into the saddle and dug her heels into Daisy's sides, Clara felt the first intoxicating rush of freedom. She was leaving the dirt, the corruption, and the terrifying obsession of Josiah Danvers behind her. The cold wind whipped against her face, stinging her cheeks. But she didn't care. She was alone, relying entirely on her own wits and courage. She preferred the deadly honesty of the wild mountains to the deceitful safety of the town. By 3 a.m., the initial adrenaline that had propelled Clara out of the canyon began to wear off, replaced by a creeping, bone-deep dread. The temperature was plunging rapidly. The sky, which had been clear and dotted with a million diamond-like stars when she left, was now choked with heavy, charcoal-grey clouds. The first flakes of snow began to fall, tiny and sharp as shards of glass, stinging her eyes and accumulating on Daisy's mane. The trail narrowed, becoming a perilous ribbon of loose rock bordered by a sheer drop into a black abyss on her left and an impenetrable wall of granite on her right. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her horse's hoofs and the eerie, mournful howling of the wind through the pines. Clara pulled her collar up, shivering violently. She knew she had roughly 20 miles to go before she reached the next settlement, a small logging camp where she might find a stagecoach heading east. But 20 miles in a mountain blizzard could mean a death sentence. "You can do this," she told herself fiercely, gripping the leather reins until her knuckles turned white. "You survived the fever that took Mother. You survived Father's death. You will survive this." Suddenly, Daisy stopped dead in her tracks. The horse tossed her head, her ears pinning back flat against her skull. She let out a nervous whinny, dancing sideways toward the edge of the cliff. "Easy, Daisy, easy," Clara coaxed, her voice betraying her rising panic. She peered into the swirling white curtain of snow ahead. Nothing. Just the relentless, blinding dark. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of snow being crushed under immense weight. It was rhythmic. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone or something was on the trail behind her. Clara's blood ran cold. Josiah. He must have discovered she was gone. Perhaps he had gone to her room to force his way in, only to find the empty bed. He had deputies, tracking dogs, men who would sell their souls for a handful of silver coins. Her hand flew to the saddlebag, frantically tearing at the frozen buckles until her fingers grazed the cold, hard steel of the Colt revolver. She pulled it free, the heavy weapon shaking violently in her grip. She turned Daisy around, facing the dark trail she had just climbed. "Who's there?" Clara yelled, her voice sounding small and fragile against the roar of the mountain wind. "I'm armed. I swear to God, I'll shoot." From the veil of falling snow, a massive shape slowly materialized. It was a horse, twice the size of her mare, a great black beast that seemed to blend into the night itself. Astride the animal was a mountain of a man. He wore a thick, snow-dusted coat made of grizzly bear hide, the collar turned up against the storm. A wide-brimmed hat obscured the upper half of his face, but a thick, dark beard covered his jaw. Slung casually over his back was a long-barreled Winchester rifle. It wasn't Josiah. It was Silas Cole. Clara recognized him instantly. Everyone in Deadwood Gulch knew of Silas Cole, though few truly knew the man. He was a trapper, a scout, a phantom of the high country, who only came down to the settlements twice a year to trade furs for coffee, gunpowder, and salt. Rumors followed him like stray dogs that he had fought in the bloodiest skirmishes of the war, that he had lived with the Utes, that he had once killed a mountain lion with nothing but a hunting knife. The townspeople viewed him with a mixture of awe and deep-seated fear. "Lower the iron, Miss Higgins," Silas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting deep underground. It easily cut through the howling wind. "Your hands are shaking so bad you're liable to shoot your own horse in the ear." Clara kept the gun raised, her heart pounding. "What are you doing here, Mr. Cole? If Josiah paid you to track me, Josiah Danvers couldn't afford to buy the dirt off my boots," Silas interrupted calmly. He nudged his massive black horse a few paces closer. Clara instinctively backed Daisy up. "Then why are you following me?" she demanded. Silas pulled back the reins, stopping a respectful distance away. He reached up with a thick, leather-gloved hand and tipped his hat back, revealing piercing, steel-grey eyes that seemed to catch what little light there was. His face was weathered, lined with the harsh realities of a life lived outdoors, yet there was an unexpected gentleness in his gaze. "I ain't following you," Silas said. "I'm intercepting you. Danvers noticed you were gone about an hour ago. One of his deputies saw the stable doors swinging in the wind. Right now, he's got 6 armed men saddling up. They're bringing the hounds." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. The gun lowered slightly as the terrifying reality washed over her. 6 men. Dogs. She wouldn't stand a chance in the snow. They would run her down before dawn, and Josiah would drag her back to town in chains, broken and defeated. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, her voice cracking. "What do you care what happens to me?" Silas fell silent for a long moment. He looked past her, out into the swirling darkness of the canyon, before bringing his steady gaze back to her face. "Your father, William. He was a good man. 7 years ago, I caught a bad bullet in a skirmish near Telluride. An infection set in. I dragged myself into Deadwood Gulch, half dead. Nobody would touch me. Your father took me into the back of his mercantile. He poured whiskey in the wound, dug the lead out himself, and let me sleep in his storeroom for 2 weeks until I could walk." Clara stared at him in shock. Her father had never mentioned this. "I owed him my life," Silas continued, his voice tightening with a suppressed emotion. When I heard about the accident at the Lady Luck mine, I came down from the high country. I've been watching the town, watching Josiah. I knew what he was planning to do to you. I was going to pull you out of that boarding house myself tonight, but you beat me to it. Clara swallowed hard, tears of frustration and terror pricking her eyes, instantly freezing on her lashes. She holstered the heavy revolver, sitting up straight in her saddle despite her trembling. I appreciate your warning, Mr. Cole, and I'm glad my father was able to help you. But I am leaving. I'm crossing this pass, and I am going to make a new life for myself. I have to do this alone. If they catch you helping me, Josiah will have you hanged. Silas didn't move. He just looked at her, noting the fierce, stubborn pride jutting from her frozen chin, the desperate fire in her eyes. He saw a woman who had been backed into a corner, stripped of everything she loved, who was still willing to ride into a deadly blizzard just to stay free. Slowly, Silas spurred his black horse forward. The massive animal closed the distance, stepping alongside Clara's mare. The wind whipped Silas's bearskin coat, brushing against Clara's leg. He reached out and gently laid his massive, warm hand over her freezing, trembling fingers, gripping the reins. "Miss Higgins," Silas said, looking directly into her eyes. The steel in his gaze was replaced by a fiercely protective vow. "I let your father die because I wasn't there to stop it. I'll be damned if I lose you to that snake or to this mountain." He turned his horse to face the treacherous, snow-blind trail ahead, positioning his massive frame to block the biting wind from hitting her directly. "You tried to leave alone," Silas said, the deep rumble of his voice echoing like a promise into the dark, violent night. "But you're never alone again. Now ride close. The storm's about to break." The high country did not forgive trespassers, and the blizzard that descended upon the canyon was a wrathful, blinding whiteout. Within 20 minutes, the trail had vanished beneath a foot of rapidly drifting snow. The wind screamed through the granite spires of Uzel Peak, driving ice crystals into Clara's skin like tiny, frozen needles. If not for the massive silhouette of Silas Cole and his black stallion breaking the drifts ahead of her, Clara knew she would have already ridden straight off the edge of the precipice. "Keep her moving," Silas roared over his shoulder, his deep voice miraculously cutting through the gale. "Horses stop in this. They freeze standing up." Clara tightened her grip on the reins, leaning forward to shield Daisy's eyes from the stinging snow. Her hands were completely numb inside her woolen mittens, her boots blocks of ice. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape from Deadwood Gulch was long gone, replaced by a deep, agonizing exhaustion. Yet beneath the terror and the cold, a strange sense of awe flickered within her. Silas rode the mountain as if he were a part of it, his instincts sharp, his broad shoulders easily absorbing the brutal punishment of the storm. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howling wind, a low, rhythmic, mournful sound that echoed off the canyon walls. A woo! Clara's blood turned to ice water. It was a sound that belonged in a nightmare. "Hounds," Silas said grimly, hauling his stallion to a halt. He twisted in his saddle, his steely eyes squinting into the impenetrable darkness below them. Josiah brought the Missouri brindle hounds. He must have wired to the penitentiary in Laramie for them days ago. He was preparing for a hunt even before you ran. Clara gasped, the freezing air burning her lungs. They can track us in this snow. A brindle hound can track a ghost through a hurricane, Silas replied, his jaw set. And they're moving fast. Josiah's pushing his men hard. That tracker, one-eyed Pete Garrison, must be leading them. He's a ruthless bastard, but he knows the trail. Crack, the sharp, unmistakable report of a Winchester rifle echoed from the switchback directly below them. A bullet whined viciously through the air, striking a pine trunk 10 yards to Clara's left and showering them in splinters and snow. They were shooting blind into the storm, hoping to get lucky or spook the fugitives' horses. Daisy reared, terrified by the gunshot. Clara was nearly thrown from the saddle, her boots slipping from the frozen stirrups. She clung desperately to the mare's mane, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a flash, Silas was beside her. His massive, gloved hand shot out, catching Daisy's bridle and forcing the panicked horse back down to all fours with sheer, brute strength. "Hold on to me," Silas commanded, his voice dead calm despite the gunfire. "We can't outrun them on this trail," Clara cried out, her voice trembling. "They're too close." "We aren't going to outrun them," Silas said, pulling his own rifle from its scabbard. "We're going to disappear. Follow my track exactly. Don't deviate an inch." Without waiting for her reply, Silas spurred his stallion off the main trail, plunging directly toward what looked like a solid wall of granite to their right. Clara swallowed her terror and forced Daisy to follow. As they approached the cliff face, Clara saw a narrow, jagged fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse, completely hidden by the shadows and the drifting snow. It was an old Ute hunting trail, steep and treacherous. They urged the horses up the steep incline, the animals groaning as they fought for footing on the loose, snow-covered scree. The baying of the hounds grew louder, more frantic. They had reached the spot where Silas and Clara had just been standing. "Silas," Clara whispered harshly, looking back over her shoulder. Below them, through a break in the swirling snow, she saw the faint, erratic dancing of kerosene lanterns on the trail. "They're right below us," Silas dismounted swiftly, moving with terrifying silence for a man of his size. He handed his reins to Clara. "Hold Goliath. Don't let them whinny." He reached into his heavy saddlebag and pulled out a thick, waxed paper cylinder. Dynamite. He grabbed a flint and steel from his pocket and crept back to the edge of the fissure, looking down at the main trail. The lanterns were directly beneath an unstable, massive overhang of snow and ice, heavily corniced by the wind. Clara held her breath, pressing a trembling hand over Daisy's muzzle. Below, she heard the harsh, cruel voice of Sheriff Josiah Danvers. "Garrison, where did they go? The tracks end here," Josiah bellowed. "Wind's filling them in, Sheriff," Garrison yelled back. "Dogs are confused. Give 'em a minute." Silas didn't hesitate. He struck the flint. A spark caught the short fuse, fizzing with a brilliant, angry red light. He tossed the explosive in a high arc, landing it deep within the massive snow cornice 50 feet above the trail. Then he scrambled backward, diving behind a boulder. "Cover your ears and close your eyes," Silas yelled. The explosion tore through the night like a clap of thunder from hell. The ground shook violently, nearly knocking Clara off her horse. The sound of the blast was immediately swallowed by a deeper, more terrifying roar. The cornice shattered. Thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rock collapsed, plunging down onto the main trail with the force of a freight train. Shouts of terror erupted from the deputies below, followed by the panicked whinnying of horses and the frantic yelping of the hounds, all instantly muffled by the deafening crash of the avalanche. A thick cloud of white powder blew up through the fissure, coating Clara and the horses. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only the sound of settling snow. Silas stood up, brushing the snow from his bearskin coat. He looked down the cliff edge, his face an unreadable mask. That won't kill them. The shelf is wide enough there. They probably push back against the rock wall, but it just buried a quarter-mile of the trail. The dogs won't be able to track through 50 feet of fresh avalanche debris, and they'll spend until noon digging their horses out. He turned back to Clara, his grey eyes softening as he saw her shivering, pale face. Come on, I know a place just up the ridge. We're safe for tonight. The refuge was a shallow limestone cavern hidden behind a frozen waterfall, a place Silas called the Weeping Wall. The thick curtain of blue ice blocked the wind entirely, trapping the air inside. It smelled of ancient dust, damp earth, and the faint, comforting scent of dry wood. By the time they unsaddled the horses, Clara's teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. Her legs gave out as she slid to the cavern floor, leaning heavily against her leather valise. Silas moved with practiced efficiency. From a deep cleft in the rock, he pulled out a cache of dry moss, tightly bound bundles of pine kindling, and a few split logs, supplies he had hidden away years ago for emergencies exactly like this. Within minutes, he had a small, smokeless fire burning brightly. He walked over to Clara, who was curled into a tight ball, and knelt beside her. Without a word, he unfastened his massive, heavy grizzly bear coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The coat smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and leather. It was incredibly heavy, but the warmth it provided was immediate and life-saving. "Drink this," Silas said, pressing a silver flask into her numb, fumbling hands. "It's rye. It'll burn, but it'll push the blood back to your fingers." Clara took a small sip. The liquid fire raced down her throat, making her cough, but a welcome heat began to radiate in her chest. She looked up at him. Silas had only a woolen flannel shirt on now, the firelight casting deep, flickering shadows across his broad chest and the rugged planes of his face. He was looking at her with a quiet, intense study. "You're a brave woman, Clara Higgins," Silas said softly, sitting cross-legged across the small fire from her. "Most men would have frozen in their boots facing Josiah Danvers. You rode into a blizzard." "I was terrified," Clara admitted, her voice hoarse. She pulled the bearskin coat tighter around herself. "I still am." "Fear keeps you alive up here," Silas replied, feeding another piece of kindling to the flames. "It's panic that kills you." The silence stretched between them, comfortable and warm, a stark contrast to the violent storm raging outside the wall of ice. Clara watched his strong, calloused hands expertly tend the fire. You mentioned my father earlier, Clara said softly. You said you dragged yourself into his store after a skirmish near Telluride. You were in the war. Silas's hands stilled for a moment. He looked into the fire, his eyes darkening with memories he clearly preferred to keep buried. 2nd Colorado Cavalry. We fought the Texas boys at the Battle of Glorieta Pass. It was a bloodbath, but that wasn't what broke me. He paused, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. It was later. Sand Creek. Our commanders ordered us to fire on a peaceful camp. Cheyenne and Arapaho. Women. Children. I refused to pull the trigger. My younger brother, Thomas. He didn't refuse. I tried to stop him, but the madness of the crowd took him. He died a year later in a saloon fight in Denver, rotting from the inside out with guilt. Clara listened, her heart aching at the profound sorrow in his deep voice. After that, Silas continued, looking up to meet her eyes. I realized I couldn't stomach the civilized world anymore. The laws of men are corrupt, written by cowards to protect thieves. Up here in the high country, the rules are honest. The mountain doesn't lie to you. It doesn't backstab you. It just is. He gave a small, bitter smile. I promised myself I'd never get involved in the affairs of the towns again. But then, I met your father. He was a rare, good man, and when I saw what Josiah was doing to you. Clara reached out from beneath the heavy coat, gently laying her hand over his rough knuckles. He didn't pull away. Josiah isn't just obsessed with me, Silas, Clara said, her voice dropping to a serious whisper. She pulled her valise closer and unbuckled the leather strap. From beneath her spare dresses, she withdrew a thick, leather-bound book with brass corners. What is that? Silas asked, his brow furrowing. My father's private ledger, Clara said. My father was the town treasurer, as well as the mercantile owner. 3 days before he died, he was frantic. He told me he had found something terrible. I hid this under the floorboards of my bedroom. She opened the book and turned it toward Silas. Josiah hasn't just been collecting illegal taxes. He's been skimming off the top of the Lady Luck Mines shipments for 2 years. He's stolen nearly $40,000 in silver, laundering it through a fake holding company in Chicago. My father was going to take this ledger to Judge Horace Blackwood in Denver to have Josiah federally indicted. Silas stared at the neat columns of ink. His jaw tightened until a muscle ticked in his cheek. And that's why the dynamite accidentally went off in the mine when your father was inspecting it. Yes, Clara said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. Josiah murdered him. He wanted to marry me to gain legal control of my father's estate and ensure he could tear my house apart legally looking for this book. If he knows I have this, he will never stop hunting us. Then we make sure he never gets the chance, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached over and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was startlingly tender. We get you to Denver. We get this ledger to Judge Blackwood, and Josiah Danvers hangs. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over them. In the quiet intimacy of the cavern, Clara looked into Silas's eyes and saw not just a rugged mountain man, but a protector, a partner. She felt an undeniable pull toward him, a deep, resonant connection forged in the fires of survival. As the hours passed, exhaustion finally claimed her. She drifted to sleep, curled near the fire, wrapped in his coat, lulled by the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing as he kept watch. When Clara woke, the fire was reduced to glowing red embers. The howling of the wind outside had ceased, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. Pale, bluish morning light filtered through the thick ice of the waterfall. Silas was standing near the cavern entrance, peering through a brass spyglass down into the canyon below. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders tense. Clara sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Silas. Did the storm break? He lowered the spyglass, turning to look at her. His face was grim, the lines around his eyes deeply etched. The storm broke, Silas said quietly, his voice carrying a heavy weight. But Josiah didn't turn back. He didn't even bother digging through the avalanche. Clara stood up, panic rising in her chest. What do you mean? Where are they? Pete Garrison is smarter than I gave him credit for, Silas replied, walking over to his saddle and checking the action on his Winchester rifle. He realized we took the high trail. They doubled back during the night and took the old mining road up the far side of the ridge. Silas looked at her, his steel-grey eyes utterly serious. They've beaten us to the Devil's Gate. They are heavily armed, they have the high ground, and they are blocking the only bridge across the gorge. We are completely trapped. Devil's Gate was a terrifying, jagged scar ripped into the earth, a canyon so deep and narrow that the roaring whitewater rapids at its bottom were cast in perpetual, icy twilight. The only way across the precipice was a terrifyingly fragile suspension bridge made of decaying hemp rope and weathered pine planks, swaying violently in the unpredictable mountain updrafts. Through the brass lens of his weathered spyglass, Silas watched Sheriff Josiah Danvers and his 5 deputies establish their lethal blockade on the near side of the chasm. They had tethered their exhausted horses behind a cluster of massive limestone boulders and taken up fortified firing positions. Their rifles were trained dead on the only switchback trail leading down to the bridge. They have us in a crossfire, Silas murmured, collapsing the spyglass with a sharp click and sliding it into his saddlebag. He turned to Clara, his expression harder than the ancient granite surrounding them. If we ride down there, we'll be cut to ribbons before we get within 50 yards of the ropes. Josiah isn't here to take you back alive anymore. He's here to bury his secrets. Clara clutched the leather-bound ledger to her chest, her knuckles white beneath her woolen mittens. The biting wind whipped her hair across her face. Then what do? We can't stay up here on the ridge. We'll freeze tonight, and we have no food left. Silas looked out over the gorge, his mind working with the cold, lethal precision of a cavalry scout. He glanced at the sheer, vertical cliff face, rising high above the deputy's fortified position, then down at the heavy saddlebags strapped to his black stallion. I have 2 sticks of dynamite left, Silas said slowly, his steely eyes calculating the deadly geometry of the canyon. But I can't throw them far enough from the trail to do any good. I have to get directly above them. Above them? Clara gasped, looking at the near vertical wall of black ice and jagged rock. Silas, that's suicide. The wind alone will tear you off that wall. One slip and you'll fall hundreds of feet onto the rocks. I've climbed worse in the dark during the war, he replied, his voice steady and resolute. He reached out, his heavy gloved hands gripping her shoulders with a gentle strength. "Listen to me, Clara. I'm going to scale the blind side of that ridge. It will take me 20 minutes to get into position. When you hear the first blast, you ride Daisy out of the tree line and make a break for the bridge. The blast will blind them and deafen them for just a few seconds. That's your window. Don't look back." "No," Clara protested, her voice breaking as tears of sheer terror welled in her eyes. "I won't leave you behind. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. You said it yourself on the trail, never alone again. I am not crossing that bridge without you." Silas's chest tightened. He looked down into her fierce, tear-streaked face and saw the unyielding, magnificent spirit that had drawn him down from the high peaks in the first place. He slowly lowered his hands, a grudging, deeply affectionate smile touching the corners of his mouth. "All right," Silas breathed, the fierce protectiveness in his eyes burning brighter than the morning sun. "All right. We play a different hand." He unbuckled his gun belt and handed his heavy Colt revolver to Clara. "Hide the ledger in your coat. Keep the iron cocked and out of sight. We ride down together, right into the open." Clara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she didn't argue. She slipped the ledger inside her dress and concealed the heavy pistol beneath the folds of the oversized bearskin coat. She mounted Daisy, her jaw set with grim determination, and fell in line beside Silas's massive black stallion. They rode slowly out of the protective timber, the hooves of their horses echoing loudly against the canyon walls. Down at the blockade, a triumphant shout rang out. Rifles were immediately raised, the harsh sunlight glinting cruelly off the blued steel barrels. "Hold your fire," Josiah Danvers bellowed, stepping out from behind a limestone boulder. He wore a heavy wool duster, his silver sheriff's star pinned proudly to his chest. A smug, victorious grin split his face as he leveled a double-barreled shotgun at Silas. Well, well, the wild mountain man and the runaway bride. "You've run out of mountain, Cole." Silas brought his horse to a halt 30 yards from the blockade, keeping his hands resting lightly on the saddle horn. "It's over, Danvers. Let the girl pass. You have no legal right to hold her." "I am the law in Deadwood Gulch," Josiah spat, his face flushing with arrogant rage. "She is a ward of my court, and she stole town property when she fled. Now get off the horse, Cole, before I have Pete blow you out of the saddle." From behind a rock, one-eyed Pete Garrison chambered around in his Winchester, taking careful aim at Silas's chest. "She didn't steal anything, Josiah." Silas's voice boomed, deep and resonant, echoing across the gorge. "Unless you consider the truth to be town property." Clara spurred Daisy forward, moving slightly ahead of Silas. She reached inside her coat and pulled out the brass-cornered ledger, holding it high in the air for all the deputies to see. $40,000, Josiah, Clara yelled, her voice trembling but echoing powerfully off the canyon walls. $40,000 in silver, skimmed from the Lady Luck mine and wired to Chicago. That's what my father found in this ledger. That's why you blew up the tunnel while he was inside. A stunned, heavy silence fell over the gorge. Even the howling wind seemed to pause. The 5 deputies behind the rocks slowly lowered their rifles, glancing at one another in utter confusion. "Shut your mouth, you hysterical woman," Josiah screamed, his face turning a mottled, furious purple. "She's lying. Shoot them. Pete, shoot the man." But Pete Garrison didn't fire. He looked at Josiah, then back at the ledger in Clara's hand. The deputies of Deadwood Gulch were rough men, underpaid and overworked, but they weren't blind killers. They had followed Josiah to retrieve a runaway, expecting a bonus. They hadn't signed up to cover up the murder of William Higgins, a man who had extended them all credit at his mercantile when times were lean, while their sheriff sat on a stolen fortune. "Boss," Deputy Hutchinson, a young man with a ragged beard, stepped forward cautiously. "Is she telling the truth about the silver? Have you been holding out on us?" "I said shoot them," Josiah roared, wildly turning his shotgun toward his own men. It was the fatal mistake Silas had been waiting for. In a blur of motion, too fast for a man of his size, Silas drew his Winchester from the saddle scabbard and fired from the hip. Crack! The shot shattered the wooden stock of Josiah's shotgun, tearing the weapon from his hands and sending him spinning into the dirt with a scream of agony, his fingers instantly broken by the impact. Silas racked the lever, chambering another round, and leveled the smoking barrel at the deputies. But there was no need. Pete Garrison threw his rifle into the dirt and raised his hands. Hutchinson and the others immediately followed suit, stepping far away from the groaning, defeated sheriff. "Bind his hands," Silas commanded coldly. "You're all riding with us to Denver to testify to Judge Blackwood. Do that, and you walk free." 2 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with the scandal of the decade. Josiah Danvers was stripped of his badge and sentenced to life in the territorial penitentiary. Clara's family estate was fully restored, the stolen funds reclaimed. She could have lived a comfortable, wealthy life in the city. Instead, on a crisp morning, Clara stood at the edge of Denver. Beside her stood a massive black stallion, and astride it was a man in a grisly bear coat. Silas reached down, offering her his hand. Clara took it, pulling herself up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, and together they rode back toward the untamed, snow-capped peaks, two souls who had finally found their home, never to ride the treacherous trails alone again. What a breathtaking, justice-fueled ride through the high country. Clara and Silas proved that the deepest love is forged in the fires of survival, and the truth always finds the light. If this wild mountain romance made your heart pound, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more epic stories. Tell us in the comments, would you have crossed the Devil's Gate for love?